This is Hobby Talks, a podcast series exploring politics and policy-focused conversations with experts, scholars, and those guiding the most complex issues facing our region and state. This podcast is a production from the Hobby School of Public Affairs in partnership with the Center for Student Media at the University of Houston. In this episode, Hobby Talks host Jim Granado discusses the redistricting battle in the state and the life and legacy of political scientist Richard Murray.
Welcome to Hobby Talks. I'm your host, Jim Granado, Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. In this episode, I'm joined by a renowned political scientist, Richard Murray, to discuss what's next in the state's redistricting battle. He is a professor emeritus in the University of Houston's Department of Political Science and a senior research fellow at the Hobby School. Dr. Murray has been a fixture of local and state political punditry for decades, serving as a go-to resource for many journalists. He is also a respected pollster, playing an instrumental role in establishing the Center for Public Policy's polling operations. Let me also add, he was a central force in creating the Center for Public Policy. He likes to say it wasn't him, but he was a founder, I would say. He also was very important in recruiting personnel that serve at the Hobby School to this day. Dr. Murray has also helped launch the Civic Houston Internship Program. It was 29 years ago and now has over 1,800 students that have served. So, Dr. Murray, Dick, before we go through several questions, I'd like to ask you about yourself. You were born in Louisiana, correct?
That's correct.
What city?
Baton Rouge.
Okay. And what got you interested in politics?
Well, my parents moved out without consulting me to Livingston Parish, east of Baton Rouge, when I was about 2 or 3. And neither had much formal education. They were 8th grade educated folks who had originally grown up in Mississippi, but they were very interested in politics. And we had a radio, battery, no electricity in our house. And, so my earliest memories are up listening to my father and mother talking about elections. I vividly remember the 1948 presidential election where, to some surprise, President Truman defeated Governor Dewey. And my father was a typical white Southern Democrat, and he was just delighted. And, you're a little kid, you pick up on those things. So I grew up in a political household. Occasionally politicos would come through, and I had an uncle by marriage in Baton Rouge who was from a not wealthy but a fairly socially prominent family that were deeply involved in politics, and they were strong supporters of the Long faction in Louisiana. So as a kid, I got exposed and I interested in, I was listening to election returns all of my youth and rooting for one side or the other.
So you're a first-timer, though, too, in terms of going to college. You said your parents were 8th grade educators?
I have 2 older sisters. One of them was working mostly at the Baton Rouge newspaper, The Morning Advocate, and she took a few classes at LSU before she met and married a young, very nice man from Venezuela. And so was the first member of our family to actually take college classes. But, yeah, I got a great scholarship coming out of high school, and it's a wonderful opportunity. And LSU was close by, and my aunt and uncle lived nearby, so I was not at all intimidated by going to the big flagship university, and loved it. And initially thought I would be a mechanical engineer, but the Nazi refugee teaching calculus convinced me that that wasn't probably the good plan. So then I thought I'd go to law school, but my professors at LSU said, we've got plenty of lawyers. What we're going to need are a lot more professors, because all across the country, in New York, California, Texas, lots of new universities were opening up. State systems were expanding. So it's great advice, and I'm forever grateful as a junior and at LSU for deciding not to go into senior ROTC. I sniffed out Vietnam a bit earlier than some, and second, that I was diverted into government there in political science, and it's great advice, and it's been enormously satisfying to be in this field.
Did your parents encourage you to go to college?
Excuse me?
Did your parents encourage you to go to college? Was that something that was expected? You had your sisters, right?
Well, told my father I decided to go into graduate school, and he said, I didn't know you were going to be a doctor. The only doctors he knew were medicos. So they were fine. They were older. My parents were in their 40s when I was born, and they sort of turned me loose. And although I stumbled several times, which I will not discuss, I had a supportive environment. But I also had a good idea that I wanted to get off the farm, and so I took to it like the duck to water.
Yeah. I mean, the older generation, I remember when my grandfather, he had an 8th grade education. He said to me when I was going to go to grad school, and parents were fine about it. My grandfather said, quit playing the fiddle and get on with it.
Well, we couldn't afford a fiddle, but harmonica maybe.
So you apply to a bunch of places, and you wind up going to the University of Minnesota. So that's going to be a big change in terms of weather, but also politics too. Yeah. So how was that for you? Was it a shock when you got there?
In some ways, but I really wanted to get out of the Deep South. I grew up in the 40s and 50s, and Jim Crow was an everyday reality in rural small towns. And I really disliked it. My father, let me say frankly, was a racist, a fan of George Wallace. My mother was not. And I sided with my mother. I really didn't like what I was seeing in the way black folks were treated. And I knew that outside the South, there was a much more accepting climate. So the schools I applied to, Berkeley, which was my first choice, Wisconsin and Minnesota. Berkeley admitted me but didn't offer money, and as a poor student, I needed financial support, and I chose Minnesota. I was also getting married to a registered nurse, and in the college economics, smaller college towns like Iowa City have something of an oversupply of nurse spouses. In a big city like Minneapolis, that's not an issue. So there were a lot more economic opportunities for my wife in going to, say, Minneapolis versus Madison, Wisconsin.
And your mentor at Minnesota, was it Frank Soroff?
Frank Soroff was one of my major professors, a wonderful student of American politics generally and political parties in particular. He's also chair of the department at times and ran a very tight ship. I also had, as a leading professor, Mulford Q. Sibley, a political philosopher, and controversial because Mulford was a sort of ultimate defender of free speech. He was a conscientious objector during World War II, would sponsor any college club from the Minnesota Nazis to the nudists. And he was a target, and working for a very controversial professor in 1963 and 64 was good training for today, say, when academics are back in the news.
It is amazing how these things just flare up. It's like we never learn.
Yeah. Well, I learned let everybody have a voice.
Yeah.
And that's my standard. I don't like to pick one side or the other. And sometimes people say outrageous things, but as long as they're not directly putting someone else in danger, I'm a free speech advocate.
Yeah. That's what a university should be doing. So you graduate from Minnesota, and you wind up coming to the University of Houston. Did you have other alternatives besides here?
I did, but I wanted to go to a big city. I'd spent enough time in rural America, and I had offers from the University of Georgia at Athens. It probably would have gotten offers from Penn State, University of Kentucky. But I had a connection to the political science department at the University of Houston because the professor I was working with at Minnesota, Charles Backstrom, was part of a national study, and Cliff McCleskey, a leading political scientist of Texas politics here at UH, was one of the national people, and that was a connection. I got an interview easily. I had favorable impressions of Houston. Some of my cousins had lived here, and although I visited other schools, once Houston was clearly interested in hiring me, that pretty much closed it for me. I wanted to come here. and it was a great decision.
So you're trained as a political scientist, but your career, you do the traditional academic work, but you also have expanded in this vast area where you do a lot of, I guess the word is public service. I mean, and we'll talk about all those issues, but how did that happen? So you come here in 1966, right?
That's correct.
So how did you go from, teaching your classes, doing your research to becoming, doing polling and and being an advisor and all these other things you've done? How did that happen? Did it happen early on when you got here?
I had no game plan. I was hired here as a political theorist.
Okay.
But I pretty quickly decided, I really like practical politics. And a couple of experiences. Houston, the University of Houston was one of the, or not, I believe it was the first public university in Texas to integrate. That happened a couple of years before I arrived, and well-known academic athletes like Elvin Hayes were coming here. But also we're getting a core of black students. And one of my early students was Patricia Wood. What a lovely African-American lady married to Bill Wood, a lawyer. He was running for the legislature. And, she thought because I have a PhD in political science, my professor, well, I didn't know a darn thing, but I was willing to pitch in. And I got introduced very early to a lot of the African-American political activists and leaders. And Houston was a pretty big town, but you have different communities like the horse people that play polo and so on. And then you have the people in the black community that were politically active. And I met a lot of them very quickly. And I was, happy to volunteer, and my wife would help. And so we met these people that were running for office, and I was always kind of numbers guy. And Houston, was changing a lot. So I immersed myself, found my way to the county clerk office downtown and started studying the election returns. And so it was kind of a natural flow. It wasn't part of a game plan. But, early on, you meet people like Barbara Jordan, who was then a state senator, and young activist Vicki Leland, and it's just sort of a natural evolution. And my teaching interest flowed in that way, so I gave up teaching political theory and started teaching American and Texas politics, and a couple of years after I had arrived here. So not a game plan, but just a sort of natural evolution. I like to think of myself as keeping my eyes and ears open and seeing opportunities. And I was not trained as a political pollster, but there wasn't much polling going on in Texas. And starting with some of my students, I began to do some very low-level surveying. And at the same time, one of the local TV stations, KHOU Channel 11, was looking for a new political analyst. And one of my students worked the switchboard there, and he said, "Hey, you should interview my professor at UH." And so again, totally accidental. And but if you're on television, particularly in the days of the golden age of TV, people think you know something. It's not true usually. But I became a media presence because I did a lot of commentary on the news, and that opened other doors. So just one thing leads to another, and on the whole, it was a very satisfying experience and enriched my teaching, I believe, at UH to have some practical experience. And we had this, even then, very fast-growing, diverse student body. And, I could connect to a lot of those students because they were often interested in what was going on in their community and people who were running for office, and I knew something about that.
Right. So we're going on, I've mentioned already, 60 years, and let's stay on the students' focus. So you've done all these things, professor, researcher, political commentator, and many of your students, including today's current mayor of Houston, trace their start in politics to your classroom. So I'm thinking about that relationship. I mean, what are the highlights from those early days, and what are you most proud of?
Well, I really liked classroom teaching and resisted becoming an administrator and so forth and so on because I like my students, and I think they sensed that, and that almost certainly is the thing I am most proud of, that I enjoyed classroom teaching. I think my students mostly appreciated that I was interested in them, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship. And I, throughout my career, I kept wanting to teach and not really interested in getting time off from teaching or other things. That was very secondary. I got involved in other things rather accidentally, like becoming a consultant in voting rights cases, because frankly, the clients we were that needed help couldn't afford anybody, and people like myself and Chandler Davidson at Rights, we worked for free, so that made us more attractive. So starting in 1971, I began to appear as an expert witness, and I got an introduction to reality. The first case I testified in Austin, a federal court, the judge slept through my testimony. and then a couple of weeks after the trial, it turned down our clients, which was a coalition of Black and Latinos here in Houston. So it was a good introduction to the realities of life.
So one of your students was Mayor Whitmire. Could you go through, because he has said that it was a meeting with you in your office that led him to decide to run. So what's the background there? Well,
he was taking a senior class, I think, in political parties from me in the fall of 1971, same year I first testified in the voting rights case. And John Whitmire was from a hard scrabble working class background like my mother. His mother did not drive, and she was a nurse. She had to walk to her hospital or ride a bus. So I could empathize with him. He was working, paying his way through college at UH. Fortunately, tuition was very low in those days. And he was going to school during the day and working on weekends and at night, and he was behind on finishing a paper. So he stopped by, not to ask about, I think I want to go into politics, but can I get an extension? And I'm pretty much a pushover, particularly for students that I know are part-time and working, and so sure. But meantime, we'd gotten a new map from the Texas legislature that had been forced to break up the large single-member districts around the state. Here in Houston, members of the state house didn't run in a single-member district. They ran in a big at-large district, which favored the candidates that could get, say, funding from downtown interest. Because if you have 500,000 people in a district, your ability to do personal campaigning is pretty limited. But that had been broken up. We had 19 new state house districts and no incumbents in many regards. And so I had the map spread on my desk, and John Whitmire saw what I was doing, and we looked closely at the map, and he said, put his finger on this area a little northwest of downtown Houston, and said, well, the church I attend is there, and my high school is there, and I know a lot of people in that neighborhood, and I know there's no incumbent. So maybe, I've been saving up for law school, but maybe I'll just basically drop out of school for a semester, live off my law school funding, and run full-time every day for the legislature. And he did that. He went out and he knocked on every door in the district, including those that had no registered voters. He was not a particularly sophisticated 21-year-old. And one of his mentors, Bud Hatfield, who later ran for mayor, he went to it. He said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Go back and knock them again." So he did all this shoe leather campaigning. 3 strong opponents in the Democratic primary, all young men. Another one was a student of mine, and he made the runoff, and he won the runoff, and he hasn't lost an election since. He won 4 more times for the state house and moved over to the state senate for 30 years. And frustrated as the Senate in Austin became more and more run with a very tight control by the lieutenant governor, Dan Patrick, he was ready to finish his political career by coming back to Houston and running for mayor. And, this mayor job in Houston is one of the most powerful in the country. It's very different than, say, Dallas, where you're one member of the city council, but you have a city manager that runs the city. The mayor here is the city manager and heads the legislature and appoints the city judiciary. So it's kind of like the executive job that President Trump would like to have, where you run everything. And he was attracted to that, and he came back and fought his way through a very competitive primary and was elected 2 years ago. So been a long journey for him, and I've enjoyed up in the bleachers. I mean, I like the mayor and consulted with him informally, but I've never worked in his campaign. But I value his friendship.
Yeah. That's quite a story. One other thing that you did, and this is related to the Center for Public Policy, is you created the Survey Research Institute, SRI. What happened there? How did that come about?
Well, I'd started doing work for Channel 11 and then for Channel 2. And back then, media was a bit more flush than they are these days, so they would pay for certain surveys. And I had sort of learned by practice how to do scientific polling. And at that time, we had this wonderful opportunity because almost all registered voter households had landline telephones. Oh, yeah. And so you had this well-established process where you could get a random sample, which are available, of telephone numbers, and I could stratify them by geography to make sure that we had a representative sample. And so I started polling in the early 70s, and these polls became respected because we were often correct. And because you have a media sponsor, they publicize the results because they're paying for it. Yep. And so that gave me a lot more visibility as a pollster, including sometimes maybe more visibility than I would like. One of the surveys we did was in the fall of 1982, when Governor Bill Clements, the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, was running for re-election, and the Democrats had nominated Attorney General Mark White. And, Clements was, he thought, cruising to re-election. But we did a statewide survey and showed just a couple of weeks out, Mark White's ahead by 5 or 6 points. And that because it was an unexpected finding, and there weren't a lot of other polling going on, got a lot of visibility. It also got the governor's attention, and he was not pleased. So he called up some folks here at the university, and who is this guy, and what in the hell are they doing? Is he working for the White campaign, and so on and so forth. Fortunately, we had the election a couple of weeks later, and he lost by 5 or 6 points. And then he was very angry at his pollster, who had told him, "Oh no, you're ahead," and suddenly he wasn't. So that turned out okay. Not to be clear, some of the polls we've done, voters had a different idea, but mostly we earned a reputation as being nonpartisan, calling them like we see them. And I'm proud to say now that I'm no longer involved in the polling operation with folks like Mark Jones working, and the reputation is a lot better even than when I was around. So that's one of the distinctive elements of the Center for Public Policy is we do have a polling component, as we started having many years ago, and it's highly respected.
I mean, do you read Real Clear Politics? The national aggregator does they summarize all the polling, and they had done a survey of all the statewide polling operations going back to 2016, and the hobby school's accuracy was, I think, number 3 in the country.
Yeah.
I mean, getting that sample right, what you were doing, and between Mark and Renee, it's just really, we're very proud of that.
Yeah, I mean, polling has gotten a lot more difficult than when I started in the 70s. Very few households now have hard line phones. The protocol for interviewing people on cell phones are totally different, much more expensive. A lot of younger people don't answer the phone ever. Yeah. And so it's more challenging, but again, with people like Mark Jones and Renee Cross here at the University of Houston, they have made the adaptation and are producing consistently accurate surveys, including I see some just being released as we speak. Yeah. And I'm not directly involved, but I consume the things, and hey, this is very interesting and I think reliable information.
Yeah, it's a great public service, and it's one of the things that we do at the hobby school. It's something I'm very proud of. Speaking of something else I'm proud of, you've recently launched Letter from Texas, where your readers can expect data-driven commentary and insights on the shifting demographics and the future of political dominance in the state. So what topics can readers expect in the coming months, and what inspired you to start the newsletter? Let me also add, when this was first launched, I had several emails come to me saying this is wonderful, and this is from folks. So it's a hit, Dick. So what's going on with that?
Well, I've written about Texas politics off and on for 50 years. With a couple of co-authors, I was author of a textbook on Texas politics and so forth. And I moved away from that. I had other interests, late in my academic career. But these are fascinatingly interesting times in our country. In my opinion, President Donald J. Trump is one of the four most consequential American presidents in history, and with Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. Now, he's changing American politics, and it may be for good or bad. That's voters make those determinations, not me. But it's a profoundly interesting period, and particularly here in Texas, because we have the strongest economy in the United States. And that economy produces a lot of jobs, many more jobs than people in Texas can fill. So we have been, for 30 years, hiring lots of people not from Texas. Initially, a lot of them were lower-end service workers, blue-collar workers from Mexico and Central America. But more and more, we're also hiring a lot of professionals. I live down the street from the MD Anderson and other medical facilities. Those places couldn't operate without international employees. So we've become a much more diverse state, a much more urban state. And although Republicans have dominated the state's politics since 1994, that's fraying a bit because all these new Texans aren't particularly committed to the Republican or the Democratic Party. So I think it makes us much more likely to move, as Georgia has recently, into the swing state category. Not likely in my lifetime, it may be not for many years, to see Texas turn blue, but I think what Texas will turn to more is being competitive because of the changing nature of our politics. And the newsletter I'm working on currently is on Latinos, Hispanic population in Texas, which has exploded. When 40 years ago we had less than 3 million Hispanics in Texas, now there are over 12 million. Virtually all of the explosive growth between 1990 and 2010 were a result of net Hispanic increase. And the Hispanic population is different. They're more likely to be religious, often Catholic, but also poorer, more recent to the state, a higher percentage of persons that are undocumented. But they're becoming much more of a political player in our state. And although historically Democratic, I see them increasingly as a kind of jump ball vote community. They have a lot of needs in the Latino community. Many people work hourly jobs, paycheck to paycheck. They're very sensitive to economic change. And, of course, immigration has become, again, a really big issue in the country and here in Texas. And Hispanic communities are directly affected, sometimes negatively. New immigrants might take jobs away or keep wages down. But also people have deep connections to folks that are not documented, members of their family. You have a lot of blended families in Texas where the kids are U.S. citizens and the older persons are not. So it's a hot political issue in Texas, and it, of course, has become a huge issue in especially the second Trump administration, where much more so than in the first administration of President Trump, he is really aggressively not just trying to close the border. He did that in the first term, and the border is effectively closed now. But he's also got hiring up in a much larger force to try to find people in the United States, some of whom are, to be sure, criminals, violent criminals, but many of whom are just working people, and that's a hot political issue, especially in states like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California that are along the border. And it's hurt the president's standing here with Hispanics. Polling at the UH shows that the president's lost ground since he took over because he's doing something now that he didn't do in the first term, and that's aggressively rounding up people at work and other places. And that makes us a more interesting state politically because voters are unhappy with an administration, and that's the tendency these days. People don't like what they've got. tend to react. That if we see that reaction, there may be some signs of it nationally next month in the elections in states like California, New Jersey, and Virginia. But we don't have major elections here until next year, 2026. But I think we'll be a more competitive state in that environment.
So you think the immigration issue and the enforcement is a real flashpoint to what, with the Hispanic population, to what extent are things like school choice that's now in Texas, which polls popularly with the Hispanic community, but in addition, cultural issues, because Hispanics tend to be very family oriented, right? Somewhat traditional in that sense. But when we're talking about things like the controversies about gender reassignment surgery and all those other issues where they're 80-20 issues, would those things have the effect of having an Hispanic voter who's not happy about immigration, but then sees these other cultural issues going on, cause them to maybe, I guess, be a real jump ball? I mean, that's, or do you think those issues are less, those 80-20 issues are less important?
Well, a lot of cultural issues that play differently. For example, Texas has some of the most restrictive abortion rules in the country, but polling shows majority of Texans are not there. They would rather have abortion be generally evaded, and there's not much difference between Hispanics and non-Hispanics on abortion. Right. Now, on other issues like biological males playing competitive sports after transitioning to a female status, right. No, Hispanics are very conservative on that issue. Right. So you have to say, which issue are we talking about? So Democrats like to talk about abortion politics because they're on the more Republicans like to talk about transgender issues because that's an 80-20 issue, and particularly with Hispanics. But my view, especially in these times where we've got an economy that overall is growing, but with a very high level of inequality, that Hispanics are on the unequal side of that equation. I guess they are much more likely to be working hourly jobs, not to have much job protection or pensions or other buffers. And so they're sort of the first voters that if the economy goes bad, and many Hispanics thought it did in 2022 and 23 when inflation surged, and they reacted pretty strongly. Hispanics also were increasingly in favor of closing the border. One of the things we know from things like Pew Research is there's been no net immigration from Mexico since 2007. Mexico has a much lower birth rate, more jobs being created there. The people flooding across the border in the Biden surge were overwhelmingly from other parts of Latin America, most notably Venezuela, and from all over the world. Right. So these people coming through Eagle Pass, Laredo, and El Paso, they weren't Mexicans. They didn't speak Spanish. They were just passing through or headed to jobs somewhere else. Right. Denver, Colorado, Chicago, New York. And they were a huge inconvenience for people along the border. Right. So this produced a pretty big backlash. Meantime, persons of Mexican origin, who are overwhelmingly the majority of Texas Hispanics, so didn't see anything being done for the undocumented people who are already here. Nothing changed with regard to the Dreamers. No pathway to citizenship was opening up. But there were special opportunities to be given to people from Haiti or Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela. Well, the voters here in Texas aren't from there. And I think that really hurt the Democrats.
Right. Let's talk about this redistricting, this mid-decade redistricting and newly drawn congressional districts. First, take us through the background on what this could mean for voters in 2026.
Well, we've had periods in American history where there was intense partisan redistricting. Late in the 19th century, the parties were fighting it out. They'd redraw the lines all the time, and there were very few constraints. You win control of the legislature, you do it. For much of the 20th century, there was very little redistricting. Even when the population shifted, most states refused to redraw the lines because the legislators didn't want to eliminate their jobs. But the courts intervened in the 60s and said, well, you have to make the districts equal in population. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed and said, and also while you're doing that, you have to recognize that in many states, blacks and Latinos have been discriminated against, and you have to give them a fair shot at electing candidates of their choice. So we had a huge change just about the time I was arriving in Texas. And as mentioned, we had this new map that John Whitmire saw. So that was all new. And we started having a lot of court cases. And we had a very aggressive Justice Department enforcing for years the Voting Rights Act, including Republican administration. But things keep changing. The country becomes more politically polarized. Democrats go into their corner, Republicans into their corner. It's very difficult to work on bipartisan solutions, particularly on redrawing district lines. So redistricting becomes sharply partisan, and people play hardball looking for every advantage they can get. So if you have what's called a trifecta, where you're controlled in a state, the governor and both houses of the legislature, then you can, to a great degree, work your will, and the federal courts have backed off. The Voting Rights Act has been substantially diminished, and maybe even further so in coming weeks or months. So now states have a lot more free hand. And Texas has sort of taken the lead here on drawing aggressive redistricting plans, including not just after the census when you have to redraw districts to equalize population, but midterm. We saw that with Tom DeLay 20 years ago, and we are seeing it again this year. And that's a bit unusual. But it's now become a national phenomenon. Texas moves at the behest of the Trump administration to try to win 4 or 5 more seats, because the Trump administration knows we're probably going to lose some seats in the House, and they only have a 3-vote margin now, so they're trying to pad that a bit. In Texas, we have 38 seats, and there are 13 Democrats here, so the idea Texas is a target. And the state leadership yielded to the president's request. But almost immediately, Democrats who have the trifecta in California, they control the process. And they have 53 seats. So they say, we'll go back and redraw our lines, even though they had a state constitutional provision that it moved to a bipartisan citizen commission. But the governor of California, who has presidential ambitions, Gavin Newsom, quickly convened the legislature. They passed a new rule. It has to be approved by voters because they've got to modify the Constitution. That's scheduled for the ballot November 4th or 5th in California. So this is it. Utah has changed its rules. Missouri is changing its rules. So suddenly, sort of with Texas as the spark, we've got this surge of national redistricting, which looks like it will marginally benefit Republicans because they have more states they control. But it's unusual in the mid-decade we do a redistricting, and it suddenly becomes national, and Texas is the trigger here. So we're now in Texas, the new map had to do 2 difficult things. You have 25 incumbent Republican members. They are not interested in giving up some of their voters to help somebody else. No. Politicians are remarkably self-centered, you might be shocked to know. So first, when you redraw the map, you got to protect the incumbent members. So you can't really move too many people around or outside of those districts. But you got to try to find 5 more seats out of 13 Democrats. And that requires, in my opinion, as an expert employed by some of the black Congress members, very aggressive redistricting. Case in point, the 29th Congressional District here in Houston, drawn by the legislature in 1971. It has always elected the candidate preferred by Hispanic voters. Interestingly, for many years, that was an Anglo, Gene Green, very popular with Latinos, spoke Spanish, etc. When he retired 7 or 8 years ago, Sylvia Garcia was elected. She's been the congresswoman since, winning easily. It's a district that Hispanic voters clearly control the district. If they prefer a candidate, that candidate's going to win. Well, the new map basically cracked the district. The eastern half and the larger voting part was moved out of the 29th and assigned to a new 9th 9th District that reaches from Harris County and neighborhoods like Denver Harbor, the East End, Galena Park, all the way into Liberty County, which is a very Anglo-controlled, very conservative area that votes the other way from the Latinos here in Houston. The other part of our district, including our home that Sylvia Garcia represents, was moved, kept the number 29, but absorbed all these voters being pushed out of the old Congressional District 18, the Barbara Jordan, Mickey Leland district. So now she's between a rock and a hard place. She can follow the larger number of her voters and run over in new District 9, but will have a tough time winning in a general election against a Republican like Briscoe Kane, the conservative member from Deer Park. Or she could stick with the numbered 29, but now more voters in the Democratic primary are black than Hispanic. And you've got an election to fill the vacant seat left by the death of Sylvester Turner after Sheila Jackson Lee's demise. The winner of that district is probably going to file in the 29th district because many of their voters have been moved over there. So it's a complicated deal, but basically, if you look at biggest loser in the local congressional delegation, in my opinion, is clearly Sylvia Garcia and the voters that have been electing her, because it's unclear whether there will be a district left in the metro area that Hispanic voters will effectively control.
Right. Let's talk about Sylvia Garcia a little bit more. So she won 7 years ago, but then, so that's District 9.
She's in 29.
And then District 18, you've got, that's Barbara Jordan's district.
That's the old Barbara Jordan, Mickey Leland, Sheila Jackson Lee district.
Right.
So that's the problem with the existing 18th is when Al Green's old 9th district, performing black district, was 98% of it was moved, and it's moved over to the east and north. But most of Al Green's voters, including very, very high turnout African-American voters, were moved into the 18th. Well, you can't have 1.1 million people in a district, so you had to move 400,000 people out of the old 18th, and most of them were moved over into Garcia's district. That's her problem. That's a Democratic primary problem. The winner of the primary will be the Congress member. So it's the effective election in the 9th district. It's going to be the general election. You got to be a Democrat must beat a Republican or vice versa. In the new 29th district, Republicans won't compete. I mean, you win the primary in March, you're the Congress member. And the problem is the African Americans that were moved in have a long history of high registration and voting and being very cohesive. So that when you move in neighborhoods like Acres Home, the old base for Sylvester Turner, that's now in the 29th district. Right. Garcia's lost a lot of her very good precincts like Denver Harbor, Manchester, the East End. They're not in the district anymore. So she's got a real huge political problem unless the courts say, and this is a district that might trigger the court saying, well, we've let most of this map go forward, but no, not the 29th, because for 30 years you've had a performing district for Hispanic voters. The largest single population in our county is Hispanic, and now you don't. So there's some possibility here that the 3-judge federal court that just heard arguments about this new map might say, no, this district or that district, you may have to go back and modify. They have some history of doing this.
Right. So you anticipate that ruling to come out by December, maybe? Because you've got the midterms about a little over a year away. So you want to get this solved.
Well, this is a veteran panel that was in panel 4 years ago. Okay. So these are 3 judges that are already pretty much up to speed because they've been weighing the old map of 2021. They quickly scheduled a trial that occurred the first 10 days of this month. So the testimony's finished. They're weighing their options. And they may, of course, simply decline to intervene. That is a real possibility.
These guys are in El Paso, correct?
Right. Okay. The Hispanic candidates filed in El Paso, I believe, because all the district judges there are Hispanic.
Okay.
And so they are assured of getting the district judge on the 3-judge panel. One of them would be a Latino, and that's correct. So the case was heard in El Paso. I was one of a number of experts that submitted opinions and analysis. They're weighing their options. We have this early calendar in Texas that filing for the November 2026 election opens on, I believe, the 8th of November.
Wow.
Not very long, far off.
No.
And closes on the 8th of December. Now, the court can, as they did in 2021, say, whoa, that's too quick. We're going to make some changes and push that back a couple of months. That's what happened 4 years ago. So they may refuse to intervene, in which the map goes into effect almost certainly. They might intervene specifically, as they did in 2021, say, this district doesn't pass muster. You got to fix it. And you can't fix one without at least 4 or 5 others around it.
There's a contagion.
And then they would probably then postpone the primaries for a couple of months. But they can do that. They've done it. Or they can just say, this map is fatally flawed. And that's what a judge ruled in Alabama. And so you got to go back and redo this, or we're going to do it. So there are 3 possibilities, and probably the most likely is they don't intervene. The next most likely is they surgically intervene and say, we're going to fix this problem, and this is what you have to restore the 29th, and we'll do it.
Right.
I think they will move before November 8th, and they should, because people that are thinking of running for office should know whether they're going to run with this map or that it's going to be a while before we find the final thing. And there should be the opportunity to wait, and they can waive residence requirements so that, for state legislative office, you have to live in the district. But for Congress, not. You just have to live in the state. But if they make changes here, they can adjust the rules however they wish. They have a lot of discretion.
Okay. So, given what's happening, what does the future of the Texas delegation start to look like? Your best.
Well, it'll keep growing because we're growing faster than the country. So we've gained 9 new seats since 2000, and we'll pick up 3 or 4 additional seats in 2030, 31 when the new census numbers come out. So the delegation will get bigger, and probably at some point we'll pass California. California now has 52, 53 seats, 52, I believe. And Texas has 38.
Didn't they lose a couple?
They lost 1.
Yeah, and that was the first time in their history they lost.
Because they had been growing much faster than everybody else, and now that's topped out. And they've resumed, the population is growing again in California, but it's still not growing as fast as the nation. And because they have so many seats, they could lose 2 or 3 seats in the next round.
Right.
Texas is for sure going to gain seats. Meantime, the population of the state keeps changing pretty dramatically because you have a very low Anglo birth rate. And you still have higher birth rates, especially among immigrant families that have moved to the U.S., formed relationships, comfortable now having children. And the biggest change we're seeing in Texas is explosive growth of Asian Americans, particularly South Asians. The president of our university, of course, grew up, as did her husband, in South Asia. And so one of the biggest changes we're going to see is we're going to see more South Asians running. It's hard to draw a district for South Asians, but a lot of the communities are very politically attuned, and they have specific issues like visa policies, and some of the communities, like the Asian Indian community, have been economically quite successful. So candidates coming out of those communities can raise a lot of money. And so I think that's the next biggest change we're going to see in Texas. It's more Asian American voters, more Asian American candidates. Those communities are politically diverse. They're not especially Republican or Democratic. And again, a lot of it is, what have you done for me lately?
Right.
They're very movable. And with the Asian communities, you have a lot of highly educated, successful folks. And so they can fund campaigns. So the Latino growth will continue to outpace Anglo growth. So Anglos were over 70% of the population of Texas in 1970. Now below 40.
Right.
That decline will slow, but will continue. So by the next census, my guess is that Anglos will be about 36 or 37%. So even if this current map is enacted and protects a big Anglo majority of districts, that's probably the last hurrah. You can't continue to do this when your underlying population base keeps shrinking. So the delegation will get more racially and ethnically diverse. Final point there, for many years, Texas exported African Americans like Willie Brown, who grew up in East Texas, family moved to the Bay Area. No longer. Texas, like Georgia, has become a magnet for African American families moving in from other states, first to Dallas-Fort Worth and second to Houston. So we now have the largest black population in the United States. Our black population has passed New York and Georgia, not in percentage terms, but in absolute numbers. Over 4 million people in Texas now identify themselves as black. So, but the black population is mostly in the metro areas and it's spreading out to the suburbs. So this makes it another complication.
Right.
The old days where the suburbs are Republican, and so much less true. So if you're looking at the future of Texas politics, what I urge is watch the big suburban counties. Look, Dallas County is Democratic and will always remain. But what about Denton County and Collin North? These are huge suburban counties and very, very diverse. Locally, the most interesting county to me is Fort Bend County because it's a United Nations there. I mean, they have a substantial black population. They have a big Hispanic population. Now they've got this growing, very diverse Asian population and still a lot of conservative Anglos. So it's a cage fight out there now because you have folks from very different backgrounds. And that's where the growth is continuing. Much of rural Texas is still declining. I mean, my wife and I drive across the state with our dog to California every summer, and there are a lot of towns that are just dying.
Right.
And it's a worldwide phenomenon. Japan, Korea, England. Yeah. It's really hard to figure out how to reverse in the economy of the 21st century to give rural communities some basis for rejuvenating, growing, or even maintaining their population. But we're a big old state, so we got more territory out there than anybody but Alaska. Alaska's largely unpopulated, so rural Texas continues to struggle.
Right. I mean, that's where you saw, you would think rural Texas tends to be very conservative, but they were very concerned about the voucher program, for example, and also health care. I mean, there's two things that would make the sense is that shrinking population, but increasingly vulnerable, would push them more to the Democratic Party.
I don't think rural Texas is going to swing much to the Democrats. Yeah. They, however, continue to see their share of the statewide vote decline, and what's propping up a lot of these communities, like in the Panhandle, is Hispanics moving in, but a higher percentage are not citizens. They don't register and vote much. There's no infrastructure. So the politics are still overwhelmingly dominated outside of along the border in South Texas by rural Anglos, and they're very, very conservative on social issues. So in some counties in the Panhandle, Trump won 98% of the vote. And Trump's best county in America was this district that runs from Dalhart up in the far northwest corner all the way down to the Fort Worth area that I think Ronnie Jackson now represents, the physician to President Trump in his first term. So I think rural Texas is going to remain very, very conservative and very Republican. But voting may drop off at people because, the kids are all moving out when they finish high school, and you're not being replenished. And if people are disappointed in Republicans, I don't think they're going to vote much for Democrats. They just will skip the election.
Right.
Particularly in a midterm where voting always drops.
Right. So later redistricting, there's a slew of retirements. One of them, and I think you can comment on this, please. It will affect GOP priorities. One of them is Michael McCall. That surprised me because he's young, relatively young. He's got tremendous amount of seniority. I mean, he's a player. So,
well, he married into a very, very wealthy family, so he doesn't have to worry about where his next paycheck is coming from. And, I mean, I'm not a Congress jock. As a political scientist, I don't study those guys in Washington.
Right.
But the people who do just say the job has become a hell of a lot less attractive than it used to be.
Right.
members now are always looking over their shoulder. You don't have that many competitive districts, Democrat versus Republican, but people run against you in the primaries. And so members now, more and more of them leave their families at home and fly up on Tuesday and fly back Thursday night. Well, 40 times a year.
Right, and sleep in their office. I mean,
yeah.
Dan Lipinski, I went to,
so
he told me his life, and I was like, Jesus, I mean.
Most members used to live closer to Washington. Now, with the dispersion of the population to the south and the west, you got a long plane ride back and forth. Your wife and kids or husband and kids aren't with you. Some members live in these sort of dormitory-style deals in D.C. It's not a very attractive life. And Congress, relative to the presidency and the courts, has really lost power. The old days when the appropriators were the cardinals of the hill and had all this power. Now, particularly in the Republican Party, you've got an extremely centralized party where the president calls the shots. And occasionally a member like Massey in Kentucky or lately Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia will raise hell, but those are rare exceptions. Just about everybody else falls in line. Right. So I don't think this is a very attractive job. They're afraid to raise their salaries, so the salaries have not been adjusted. I think a member makes about $175,000. That sounds like a lot of money, but in D.C., and if you're maintaining 2 residences, it's not much. Right. So most members improve their financial status dramatically when they leave Congress. Right. So the job is less and less attractive. And I'm not surprised that more members, including here, we have a new member, Congressman Luttrell, served 2 terms, and he quit. He's a young guy. His brother was one of the lone survivor. But he got to Washington and clearly don't care for it. And if you other members like Wesley Hunt, newly elected member, again young, there's no future here. Being one of 38. He's running for the Senate. Yeah. Long shot, but hey, he's willing to take that chance.
Yeah. So back to redistricting. We've talked about some issues related to the state, but let's also talk about the national political implications of the redistricting efforts. I mean, do you see it as a wash in the end? Because you've got Republican states that are doing it, but then you've got Democratic states that are trying to respond. I think, didn't Illinois, it was California, Illinois, I forget, there was a couple of blue states that were saying, okay, you're going to play around in Texas, we're going to do the same thing. So is it possible this is just a wash?
Typically in midterm elections, there's a pretty strong surge. And when there's a surge, the boundaries matter less because people draw a map that they thought would work, but doesn't. And that could happen in Texas. But in this period, Republicans have a systematic advantage because there are more states where the legislature can redraw the lines that Republicans control than Democrats. In some of the Democratic states, like New York, there are constraints on what you can do. Like New York can redistrict, but not this cycle. So there are several Republican Congress members that are very vulnerable there, but unlike California, they couldn't figure out a way to quickly gear up and to counter Texas. So short term, a clear advantage to Republicans nationally. There are just more states like Missouri that they can do, and Democrats don't have much flexibility outside of California. Long term, redistricting can take you a ways, but even if the federal courts stay out of it, underlying population trends usually overwhelm maps. What's happening all across the whole country again is people are moving more into the big metro areas, into the suburban areas. So if you're looking at the battlegrounds of the 30s and 40s, 2030s and 40s, you're looking at battling for suburban seats. Okay. And President Trump and his coalition, MAGA coalition, has scrambled the eggs. Historically, Republicans did really well with college-educated, higher-income voters, and Democrats were the party of the working class. Well, that is not the case nearly so much. I mean, now River Oaks, the wealthiest neighborhood in Texas, is a 50-50 neighborhood. I live near West University. It's now a Democratic area. My Republican friends say, what in the hell's happened? But meantime, over in Baytown and Deer Park, where Democrats were winning 30 or 40 years ago, those are solidly Republican. More blue collar, more people that were high school graduates. So the map has been changed hugely in terms of socioeconomic class. And we continue to see the non-Anglo, defined as person who say I'm white and I'm not Hispanic, that share of the population keeps going down. So more and more districts are going to have more and more minority voters. And in my view, those districts are in many instances going to be very unpredictable. Right. I think we'll see the Democrats being under a lot of pressure in 2028 to put a Hispanic on the ticket. So keep your eye on the new senator from Arizona.
Gallegos?
Donald Trump won that state by a not by a huge margin, by several points, but a young Hispanic congressman was elected to the U.S. Senate. Yeah. Democrats had a problem with Hispanic voters in 2024. I mean, parties aren't stupid. Republicans get pounded with Goldwater in 64. They adjust. So a lot of pressure on the Democrats to try to move on from some of the woke political positions that were not popular. And Republicans will react too. With the Republican Party, the problem is Donald Trump is a unique political figure in my estimate. He's simply got personal qualities that have endeared him to a substantial part of the electorate, about a third of the American voters, but about 75 or 80% of Republicans. But he's term limited, and although there's talk about Trump for a third term, pretty hard to see any way that works. I mean, yes, you've got J.D. Vance, his choice as VP, but J.D. Vance is not Donald Trump. No. Trump has a unique set of political skills that are not transferable. And so Democrats have got plenty of problems. In the short run, they're probably okay in 2026. They just run against the stuff that's unpopular that Trump's doing. But they've got the problem when they're going to put up for president in 2028. Right. And I think they were looking for somebody that's younger and not tied to Washington, D.C. Republicans, well, post-Trump, where do you go? Right. The two leading contenders are Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance. Right. But also keep in mind political realities. President Trump is 79. He maybe has a few extra French fries now and then. He doesn't look particularly great. So there's some real possibility here that at the president in 2028 is going to be J.D. Vance. He has, like John Adams famously said in the very first vice presidency, today I am nothing, but tomorrow I could be everything. So Mr. Vance is very patiently waiting. And the last time I looked, he's 41 years old. Right. So, a Vance running for election on his own will be very different than a wide open Republican scramble, right. Which if Donald Trump finishes his term is what I imagine. I doubt that Trump will try to pick a successor. Maybe I'm wrong, but so both parties I think are going to have a fascinating round coming up after the midterms are over next year.
Let's talk about that because I'm thinking about the election of 1932. Now, to me, I consider that a critical election, which is when you see a shift. But it wasn't really solidified until 1934. And then then in 36, it was just, there were three consecutive elections where you saw a decisive Democratic majority. This, given the way the eggs are being scrambled, the way the Republican Party has changed, and the internal struggle the Democratic Party has right now between the left and I would say the let's say the harder left that's going on, or the progressives, that fight that's going on. And assuming the economy doesn't tank in the next year, is it possible the Republicans, if the midterms can go much better for them than what's traditionally expected, which means you have a replay of 1934, and then by the time you get to 2028, you've got Vance or Rubio that takes the banner, even though they're not Trump, that the demographic, the political landscape has changed where you have this realignment that now is solidified. Is that
That's a
likelihood is
potential.
low or high or medium or what?
Yes, I think correctly. The 32 election was kind of a throw the bums out.
Yes.
Virtually any
Right.
Democrat was going to win who wasn't named Hoover. Uh, but at 34, in one of those rare midterm elections, the Democrats ran the table when they had the presidency, and that's quite rare.
Right.
If Republicans gain seats or even keep their losses to a minimum and control particularly both the House and the Senate again, that would be a pretty powerful argument for those analysts that say we've got the same kind of lasting or more durable transformation with the Republican Party becoming more of a populist party, appealing to less well-educated voters, somewhat more diverse. With I don't think there's much evidence that blacks are shifting. The Trump administration is not pursuing a strategy aimed at improving standing with black voters, but maybe with Hispanics and Asian Americans, there's more of a shift that lasts. My guess is probably not. Trump's skill box does not include some of FDR's skills at building a new economically based coalition. The center of gravity in the Republican Party is still, in my opinion, the wealthier elements. Look at this bailout for Argentina, the 20 billion or 40 billion. That's not going to appeal to the populist base, particularly soybean farmers who overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump and see their largest market, China, totally shut down, and their biggest competitor is now Argentina. So sometimes you have to choose. Trump is mostly sticking with his wealthy oligarchic, as Bernie Sanders would say, backers, and not doing much to, for example, keep rural hospitals open. And so I don't see any dramatic, lasting improvement there. Rural America is going to remain heavily Republican, but that's not a basis for a future political coalition because it's shrinking. So I look for a period of political instability. Not something like the 1930s, but what happened in the United States in the late 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. Nobody could win 2 consecutive presidential elections. You had 4 or 5 consecutive elections where the out party won, and by incredibly close margins. And in that period, you had the only other case where a defeated president, then Grover Cleveland, came back and, after losing, won again in 1892. I think that's where we're at.
Okay.
That neither party, it seems to be, can get a decisive advantage, and that we're likely to see these swings.
Okay.
And instability as a consequence.
One thing that's also interesting about this second Trump administration, you've alluded to it. You said, and this is quite something, he's only been in office since late January, right? And you've said he's a very consequential president, for good or bad, depending on your political viewpoint. But he has had an effect. And when you look at what's happened, it's almost like the first term was just constant chaos. But if you look at his personnel, I mean, Susie Wiles strikes me, as a chief of staff, you have to go back to James Baker, someone that is that competent, because you are managing a person that is a disruptor. But if you look at his messaging, the discipline that you see here, the fact that also his cabinet officers, in the first term, he was constantly fighting on Twitter. Now he's on Twitter or Truth Social, but he's got several people that make the same argument. So he doesn't do it by himself. So all the Sunday shows, the talk shows, everything. You've got everything from Bobby Kennedy to Secretary Bessent, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard. You've got a bunch of people that are very articulate, on the same page that he didn't have before. And so the messaging is much better. The question is, what else is in your mind has made him that much more consequential? I mean, the other thing is the structure. Every day there's something he's doing. Every day there's, obviously the getting the hostage release is important, but there's something like yesterday was IVF. I mean, there's always something. I mean, I remember Bill Clinton did this masterfully. He always had some little issue, not little, but in the sense there was always something he did. Is his second term, and I'm seeing the same type of thing. And is he just he learned his lesson and he's just much better as a manager now? Are there other things that are making him more consequential? I mean, he's still the same guy. Well, he's still very, what's the word? Forceful. How about that for a diplomat? I mean, he's a disruptor, and so what's happened? He just learned. Is that the issue? What else can you I'm just throwing things out here to you.
Well, I think in 2016, particularly after the explosive release of the Hollywood tapes, that Trump didn't expect to win. And to the extent he did, like he had employed the former governor of New Jersey to draw up an election, and he threw that away. So he hadn't expected to win. He staffed up quickly. He admired these generals. He brought a bunch of them in. They were not loyalists. They were institutionalists. He hired the senator who first had endorsed him, Jeff Sessions, and was deeply disappointed because Sessions was a fairly traditional independent head of the Justice Department. So he was unable to command all the levers of power that a president possesses, and he learned that lesson. So when he staffed up in 2023, 24, and he was convinced, now I'm going to win, and he did a lot of pre-election planning and others for him, like the Project 2025 that he disavowed publicly but has relied upon heavily in practice. So here's someone that had learned a lot from his experience, brought in loyalists, and some of them, I think Susie Wiles has been a brilliant hire. She really helped him win the nomination, and she's controls some of his lesser politically astute impulses. Some of the people are not helpful. Egg Seth, I think, is a mistake at the Defense Department. He looks good on camera, but not helping, particularly with the president standing with the senior military folks who may be important down the road because the military is being projected into domestic politics more forcefully. The problem is, I think, the one that nobody can avoid, the clock, the calendar, that lame duck presidents lose influence, particularly if they lose control of one or both houses of Congress. And that's why the president and his people are pushing so hard on this redistricting right now, because if you go back to what we had in the last 2 years of Trump 45, the House is not going to pass anything the president wants without substantially bargaining and negotiating. They will also have the subpoena power. And, questions like they've raised this week, what happened to the $50,000 that the guy took in a bag? Well, they can't get a straight answer from that because they don't control either the Senate or the House. But if they take the House, they will. So I think the president is at the peak of his power and influence. Not uncommon. That's, very much the case with reelected presidents. So now's the time to strike as much as you can, and the president is doing as much as he can, because it's kind of downhill after this based on the historic experience of more than 2 centuries. Now, Mr. Trump has been extraordinarily fortunate in that he not only got to appoint 3 new members of the court, but that you've got the most conservative court, in my opinion, since the 1920s. And they're particularly conservative in the sense of empowering presidents' executive authority. So you don't have some of the constraints from the judiciary, and that, I believe, will continue through the next 3 years. So, yes, Mr. Trump is unquestionably, in my opinion, one of the most consequential American presidents and will remain so. He's just got an extraordinarily different style, and a lot of it meshes well with this new era of communication. But it's a unique power, and as you move deeper into the last years of his second term, some of that power inevitably fades, and it's a problem that Biden had. I mean, he had the clock was running out on him more evidently physically than is the case with Trump. Trump is an Energizer bunny. Yeah. He's all over the place. Remarkable for a 79-year-old man who's not, of ideal weight and perhaps dining habits. But that can change in a moment. But right now, he is where Roosevelt was in 1934-35 in terms of dominating the federal government. But remember, even with Roosevelt, the last couple of years of his second term, which people thought would be his last term, right, because of tradition, not because of a constitutional rule, his influence dropped dramatically. But events totally beyond his control, the coming war in Europe, the need to rebuild the American military, bailed him out and gave him the rationale to run for a third term, which Trump would love, I think, if he were particularly 20 years young. Roosevelt was 40, 58, I guess, 57, 58. So we live in very, very interesting times. And one of the reasons I wanted to stick around at the University of Houston was not to get a 60-year pin, to be sure, but to continue to be actively engaged. I'm not trying to change anything, but I want to study this extraordinary period in American history. I don't know how it's going to turn out. Nobody does. But it's sure as hell going to be different than it was we expected 10 years ago when Barack Obama was president of the United States. We're in a very, very different place and very interesting place. So I see it as a challenge, try to understand what's going on. Right. And it's wonderful to be in Houston and Texas because we're in the center of this fight.
Yeah. So 2 more questions. First one, what advice do you have for our students who want to make a difference in government?
Well, I guess I'm a bit of a classicist. I think, get a good, broad grounding in education, read widely, or, source information, whether you're reading a book or
listen to Hobby Talks when you're on.
So get a good general education. And work on your people skills. AI is coming and so forth. But I think what makes human beings unique are things like empathy, and being able to sense other people's emotions. Machines may catch up to their impact, but that's still a while. So if you're looking at the next 30 or 40 years, take advantage of the fact that you are a human being,
right,
that you can learn to read people and sense based on signals that are very subtle, and the machines are going to have a great difficulty understanding. So take advantage of your humanness. Get a broad education. Try to be as much as possible a people person. Long term, that's really important for success. Whatever route or career you choose, you're almost certainly going to have to work with other human beings, and particularly if you're going to be in a position of power or influence. And if you are thinking about politics, it's a people business. I have seen hundreds of students come through, a number of whom are politically ambitious. Some of them, like John Whitmire or Carol Alvarado, clearly have had a lot of success. Many others, not so much. In terms of success in that particular line of work, whether you choose to run for office or more likely work in government, I think you need kind of grit and determination, a sort of long-term focus. And to recognize this is a tough business. Democratic politics, you're trying to adjust, a lot of different people's concerns and different groups, and you can't please everybody. You don't make a lot of money. It's somewhat dangerous now because people attack you if you're a public figure or working for public figures. So recognize it's a challenge, but it can be rewarding. You can do things that help people. And hopefully that's the motivation that most people that go into public service, whether it's running for office or working for office holders, that's the perspective they bring. They want to make the world a better place, help people that need help. And there's plenty of things to work on out there.
Final question. Is there something I have not asked you that you'd like to talk
No, I think I've made it clear that I feel incredibly fortunate to have had a whole bunch of things happen to me that I had no control over. But one of those was ending up in the city of Houston and at the University of Houston, which has been a remarkable base for me. And I have to say, the university, has given me the flexibility and the opportunities. And so I'm just delighted that I've been able to stick around. One of the interesting things to me about the University of Houston is when I got here, the university was saying we were founded in 1934. I noticed now they were saying we were founded in 1927. So maybe I could go back and adjust my year of birth in the other direction. So the university seems to have an ability to, like Hollywood actresses, to move in the opposite direction and to become older rather than younger. So,
well, Dick, thanks for the conversation today on Hobby Talks and being our guest. And more generally, thank you for everything. I mean, personally, what you've done for the school, the university, it's very few people can show they have a record that you have. I mean, it's been remarkable. I'm very lucky to have met you many years ago.
Well, I've gotten a lot more out of this than I've given, but I'm deeply appreciative of the opportunity, and I feel very proud of the work we've done at the Center for Public Policy and how that evolved into the Hobby School and the support of the Hobby family, which you, James Granado, were terrifically vital, because Governor Hobby, one of the great lieutenant governor, the greatest lieutenant governor in Texas history, in my view, has been one of the key supporters of the university generally, where he served as a chancellor a number of years ago, but more specifically in he and his family's support for the Hobby Center. So, and I had a small facilitating role in that, but that's been one of the more satisfying elements of my career. Yeah. Thank you.
For more information on upcoming programming, please visit our website and social media platforms. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast represents the views of the guests and not of the University of Houston. The Center for Student Media provided sound and engineering support, and Soundcast Music provided the podcast song. The series is produced by the Communications and Marketing team at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. For more information on Hobby Talks, including past and upcoming episodes, visit uh.edu/hobby/hobbytalks.